All right, diving in deep today. Andrei Chikatilo, the Rostov Ripper. We've got his biography ready to unpack it all, trying to understand this infamous figure from Soviet history.
A case that really makes you think, not just about him, but about society, history, how all of that plays into these horrific acts.
It's always, well, there's that morbid curiosity,
Yeah,
right, when you hear about a serial killer. But beyond that, I think we all want to know why. Why this darkness?
absolutely. And with Chikatilo, it's even more complex because of when and where he lived. 1936, Ukraine, Stalin's forced famine, World War II looming.
Can you imagine
Yeah.
growing up with that kind of deprivation, the fear, witnessing so much suffering at such a young age? It had to leave a mark.
A brutal reality to grow up in. And there's this possibility mentioned in the biography that Chikatilo had hydrocephalus at birth. Maybe that's connected to the genital urinary problems they describe.
Bedwetting into adolescence, erectile dysfunction, those are deeply personal struggles, especially in the Soviet Union, with its emphasis on masculinity.
Yeah.
How could that not impact him psychologically? Do you think it's possible, a connection between these early experiences and the brutality he inflicted on women later on?
It's definitely a possibility. Humiliation, feeling out of control, that can manifest in destructive ways. And societal norms back then, well, they probably didn't help.
Societal norms, that's interesting because there's the story of his father captured as a POW in World War II, branded a traitor when he came back. Yeah. How do you think that impacted Chikatilo?
That shame, the stigma attached to his father, had to affect their whole family. Chikatilo being bullied, called out for his father's perceived cowardice, it just keeps the cycle of trauma going.
It's heartbreaking how external events can shape a person's life. And then there's that incident when he was 15, the failed sexual encounter the biography describes. How much do you think that set him on this path?
That was a defining moment for Chikatilo, I think. The humiliation, the ridicule. It seems to have cemented this link in his mind between sex and violence, a link that would tragically play out in his crimes.
It's almost unbelievable. Someone going through all that trauma, then building what looks like a normal life. Wife, kids, a career as a teacher.
That's what makes this case so disturbing. Chikatilo was a master of hiding, concealing his dark impulses. He had everyone fooled.
The biography talks about incidents where he assaulted children, forcing him to keep moving from school to school. It chills you to think about it. Him preying on the very students he was supposed to be teaching.
He was living a double life, no doubt about it. The outward persona completely at odds with the monster hiding underneath.
And then there's his job. A clerk for a raw materials factory in Rostov. Gave him the perfect cover. Traveling for work, access to potential victims. His hunting ground just got bigger.
Horrifying to see how everyday circumstances can be twisted by someone with those intentions.
Which brings us to Lena Zakotnova, 9 years old. His first documented victim murdered in 1978. The start of his reign of terror. But it also reveals a serious flaw in the Soviet justice system.
Right, because another man, Alexander Kravchenko, was wrongly convicted and executed for Lena's murder. That just shows how unprepared the Soviet authorities were for a serial killer.
Their whole system, their ideology couldn't handle a crime like this. The concept of a serial killer didn't fit their worldview.
It goes against everything they believed in. And that rigidity had huge consequences for the investigation. Mistakes were made, opportunities missed.
So while Chikatilo's escalating his attacks, the authorities are struggling to even grasp what they're dealing with. Let's talk about his modus operandi. What can you tell us about his victims, how he carried out these awful acts?
He was drawn to young runaways, lured them into secluded places, mostly forests outside Rostov. The brutality of the attacks shocked even experienced investigators.
The biography describes mutilation, cannibalism, and this really disturbing detail about the eyes. Chikatilo believed, even after death, his victims' eyes would retain an imprint of his face.
It's chilling. This wasn't just about violence, it was about possession, domination, erasing their identity completely.
As the body count rises, public fear explodes. And there's no real media coverage, typical of the Soviet Union back then. Imagine the terror, the uncertainty.
People were desperate for answers, blaming mythical creatures, foreign plots, anything to explain it.
While all this is happening, the investigators are working behind the scenes. What were some of the biggest challenges they faced at the start?
Like we said earlier, the Soviet Union just didn't want to admit they had a serial killer problem. Didn't fit their image of a perfect society.
So where did they even begin? What were they looking for?
They stuck with what they knew, focused on sex offenders, people considered mentally ill.
Makes sense, but I bet it also caused some new problems.
Oh, absolutely. The biography mentions how brutal their interrogations were back then. Forced confessions, a lot of them. It makes you think, the search for justice, sometimes it creates its own kind of injustice.
Tough balance to find, especially when the pressure's on. And on top of all that, there's this thing about Chikatilo being a non sequitur. What's that all about? How did it affect the investigation?
So a non sequitur, their blood type doesn't match what's found in other fluids like saliva or semen. Chikatilo, his blood was type A, but his semen was AB.
So the evidence at the crime scenes, it was pointing the investigators in the wrong direction.
Exactly. He basically had a biological shield, let him stay hidden for years. Makes you wonder how many other cases got messed up because forensic science wasn't what it is today.
It's crazy to think how far DNA technology has come since then. They had those tools back then. Maybe Chikatilo gets caught way sooner.
Chilling thought. But even with what they had, there were people who wouldn't give up. Major Mikhail Fedosov, he took over the investigation in '83. One of the first to say, hey, we might have a serial killer here.
And then he brought in Viktor Burakov, top forensic analyst, to lead things in the Shaki area. They were determined.
And it's their persistence that leads them to psychiatrist Alexander Buchanovsky. Really crucial figure in this whole story. He was like the pioneer of criminal profiling in the Soviet Union.
The biography says he came up with the term necrosadist to describe the killer. What does that even mean? How did profiling help them narrow things down?
Buchanovsky, he was saying this guy gets off on the suffering and death of others. Pretty dark stuff. But he was able to give them some specifics: age range, possible job, behaviors, gave the investigators a tighter focus.
Instead of looking everywhere, they could start zeroing in.
Exactly. And back then in the Soviet Union, this was groundbreaking stuff. They were all about Freudian psychology, didn't really help with understanding criminals.
So Buchanovsky was key, but then the biography mentions how the killings just stopped for a while. Any idea why?
Still a bit of a mystery. Some people think maybe Chikatilo got locked up for something else, or maybe he just went quiet, waited for things to cool down.
Either way, the investigators must have been frustrated. They're making progress, then bam, nothing.
But it didn't last. In '88, the killings start again. And Chikatilo, he changes things up, starts going farther out, not just around Rostov anymore.
The biography also says he got bolder, peeling in broad daylight sometimes. Was he getting cocky? Did he think he'd never get caught?
Maybe. But we also got to remember what's happening in the Soviet Union then. Gorbachev, glasnost, more openness. The media is not totally controlled anymore.
So people are finally hearing about these horrors, and the pressure on the authorities, it's got to be immense.
It was. The investigation ramps up. They try new things. Burakov, he puts undercover cops in the areas where Chikatilo was known to operate.
Cat and mouse, high stakes.
You got it. Chikatilo, he almost got away a few times, but they were closing in.
Then comes Sveta Karastik, his last victim, November 1990. What happened after that?
After the murder, police are at the train station nearby, and they see Chikatilo. He's acting all suspicious, nervous, out of place.
That's almost too easy, like something from a movie.
Maybe, but it shows how much they'd stepped up patrols, how alert they were. They get his info, routine check, right? Turns out it's a huge break in the case.
Because they link him back to that arrest in '84, the one where the blood type thing let him walk free.
Boom! The pieces start falling into place.
So they have their guy. What happens next? Do they arrest him right away?
They decide to tail him, watch his every move, build their case.
Must have been nerve-wracking. Knowing a serial killer's out there, but having to wait, play it smart.
Took a lot of discipline, but it paid off. November 20th, 1990, they arrest Chikatilo again. This time, it sticks.
Turning point for the investigation for the whole Soviet Union. The monster they'd feared for so long finally caught. Huge relief, I bet, finally having him locked up. But getting him to confess, that had to be a whole other battle.
Oh, yeah. Chikatilo, he was a master manipulator. Played it cool at first, denied everything.
So how did they finally crack him? The biography mentions Buchanovsky, the psychiatrist, coming back into the picture.
Smart move by Burakov. He brings in Buchanovsky, the guy who profiled Chikatilo, to talk to him.
Seems kind of strange. Was a psychiatrist at that point?
They knew the usual interrogation tricks wouldn't work. Chikatilo, he thrived on attention, being the center of it all. So they used that.
So they have Buchanovsky approach him not as a suspect, but more like an equal, someone whose opinion he valued.
Exactly. Buchanovsky talks about his research, the psychology of the case. It strokes Chikatilo's ego, and he starts to talk. What he reveals is just horrifying.
The biography says 56 murders he confessed to, 53 they could actually confirm. It's hard to even grasp a number like that, more than they ever imagined.
You're evil. And he even takes them to where some of the bodies were hidden, no denying it anymore.
Can't imagine what that was like for the officers. Following him through the woods, knowing what they were about to find.
Surreal, I bet, and absolutely heartbreaking, confronting the darkest part of humanity.
April 1992, the trial begins. Media frenzy, the whole world watching. The Rostov Ripper finally faces justice.
That trial, it was something else. Chikatilo, they kept him in an iron cage, away from the families of his victims. You could feel their grief, their rage in that courtroom.
The biography talks about how Chikatilo acted during the trial. Singing, rambling, even exposing himself. Was he faking it? Trying to play insane?
Hard to say for sure. Some people think it was genuine, his mind just gone. Others think it was all an act, trying to avoid responsibility.
Whatever his reason, the court wasn't buying it. Guilty on 52 counts, sentenced to death.
Valentine's Day, 1994, they execute him. Grim ending to a life filled with such cruelty.
This case. What do we learn from it? What can we take away from all this horror?
Well, practically speaking, it shows how important forensic science is and how it needs to keep evolving. That non sequitur thing, right? Tiny biological detail almost let him get away.
Makes you grateful for DNA technology. It's changed everything.
Totally. But there's more to it than just the science. This case makes you think about society, how it shapes people. Chikatilo's childhood, all that trauma and deprivation, it played a part in who he became.
We can't ignore that stuff, the social and historical context, when we try to understand these kinds of crimes.
Absolutely. And one last thing. This case, it shows how powerful dedication is, the pursuit of justice, those investigators working for years, the forensic experts pushing the limits of science, and the families fighting for answers, accountability. We can't forget their efforts.
It's a story that sticks with you. The brutality, the scale of it all. It's a dark reminder of what humans are capable of. But it also shows the importance of understanding, of being vigilant, and never giving up on justice. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of Andrei Chikatilo.